Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're watching this webinar. My name is Silvia Weinbuch. I'm the chair of the Steering IPA Communications Committee, and I will be moderating this webinar named Money Talks, Psychoanalytic Views Inside and Beyond the Consulting Room. I'm very glad to present our excellent panelists from today, Salman Akhtar, Jennifer Davis, and Leopold Nosek. Now I will tell you how we are going to work. Each panelist will present his ideas. After that, they will discuss between them. And finally, they will answer your questions in the last half an hour. Our first panelist will be Jennifer Davis. She will talk about the money in child and adolescent psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. She will discuss case material from two children, one from an affluent background, the other from a low-income family. Their and their parents' fantasies about the analyst's resources will be described. Then we will hear Salman Akhtar's presentation. After briefly commenting upon the psych functions served by money, he will delve into various psychopathological syndromes and technical issues involving money. Finally, we will hear Leopold Nosek's presentation. He will talk about some socio-ideological considerations about money, the place of money in psychoanalysis within the different human disciplines, the psychoanalyst's ideologies and clinical vignettes. This will take us about 1 hour, and as I said before, the last half an hour will be for answering the questions of the audience. Questions can be submitted at any point during the webinar by navigating to the questions section on the control panel. Type your question in the dialog box and click Send to submit your question. Selected questions by Monica Bomba will be answered during the Q&A session. So let's begin. I will introduce you our first panelist, Jennifer Davis. Jennifer Davis is a child, adolescent, and adult psychoanalyst and fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society. She has taught at the Tavistock Clinic, the British Psychoanalytical Society, University College London, and the Maudsley Hospital, also internationally, and is in the process of writing her second book. Jennifer is serving her second term on the IPA in Health Committee. So, please, Jennifer.
Okay, well, hello everybody. I'm just going to get my screen ready. Right. Surprisingly little has been written on the subject of money in child and adolescent psychoanalysis, but through play and transference, children reveal their inner poverty and wealth, as well as their fantasies about money. Fees constitute an emotional exchange between analyst and parent in child work, because of course we have the three vertices of the triangle, the analyst, the child, and the parent, as opposed to in adult work, you have the dyad. These days, payment is mostly done remotely. How does this virtual exchange affect the relationship between parent, child, and analyst? Does it encourage avoidance of an uncomfortable but meaningful topic? Female clinicians tend to charge lower fees than their male colleagues. How do we understand this, and what messages does it convey? Does altruism play a part? Children and money. Working privately with children requires that the parents pay. Children are accustomed to having much paid for by their parents. This is part of the expected parental provision. Some children have little or no idea about the workings of money. They operate largely on the pleasure principle. I want it, mommy or daddy gets it for me. To paraphrase the name Pick and Pay of a South African supermarket chain, I pick and they pay. A kind of magical access to a bountiful breast. In my experience, some children in families where financial resources are stretched seem very preoccupied with money, knowing at a young age the price of items. The sense of limit can be discovered too soon. In the consulting room, children may show their sensitivity to the size of the space, the number of toys, the make of the analyst's mobile phone, and even to the location of the room. Wealth is both concrete and the stuff of fantasy. Money can accrue different meanings and be understood at different levels, oral, anal, narcissistic, and Oedipal. It seems that children realize from quite young, especially if aware of financial hardships or family wealth, that life is unfair. Unfortunately, in some parts of the world, some children are thrown into earning a livelihood by begging or child labor. Yet, as we know, inner poverty and inner wealth are not necessarily commensurate with external poverty and wealth. Expensive possessions may provide initial pleasure and sense of worth, but then devalue as the guilt begins to wear thin and the child becomes dissatisfied. The materially endowed child may long instead for the availability of parents, for a simple home-cooked family meal. The wealth is rather the attention, thought, and time equaling love shown to the child, who thereby feels valued. Growing up with literally poor parents or emotionally poor parents, that is, preoccupied, absent, disturbed figures, can lead to the child sensing that his desire isn't right. He may be made to feel bad and guilty for asking, exemplified by Oliver Twist, who dares to ask for more and is answered, "More? You want more?" as if it were a sin. Such a child may experience depressive anxieties, feeling himself to be greedy and asking for too much. My patient Emma, 8 years old, was struggling at school. Her grades were low and her friendships didn't last. Her parents, although clearly very fond of their daughter, placed enormous store by intellect. They were very disappointed by her poor school performance. Emma's family believed in maintaining a stiff upper lip. Vulnerability and feelings were hardly talked about at home. When I first met Emma, pale and thin, dressed in expensive designer label clothes, she avoided sustained eye contact with me. She seemed frozen, uncomfortable, and initially displayed little overt interest in the play material. Holding her body tensely, she told me, "Everything's fine." It was clear that she didn't want to come to see me, especially in the middle of her precious holiday time. She relaxed a little when I took this up. Emma told me that her father had bought her her favorite ice cream before setting out on the long journey to meet me. I was to learn later that she was promised a special food treat after her sessions with me. So bribes, in the form of treats, were being used to sweeten the blow of needing to see an analyst. Apart from her silence and disengagement during our first meeting, she struck me as hiding in her repetitive, vigorous play fights between the various toy wild animals. Her capacity for holding the play in her mind was revealed by her picking up from where she left off at the beginning of the next session. Clearly, it wasn't only Emma who was reluctant, but her parents, who were ambivalent about commitment to therapy. Their work took them away from home frequently and for lengthy periods. An elderly, rather frail aunt who she often stayed with during the week couldn't bring her in the afternoons after school. So for various reasons, Emma couldn't be brought to weekly sessions, never mind daily sessions. She only attended during half term and holidays. Half term in Britain is the week in the middle of the term where children have time off. I had decided after 3 consultations to take Emma on this basis, as I was concerned about her degree of unhappiness and her developmental delays. I thought the parents underplayed the degree of their daughter's disturbance and had difficulty in beginning to reflect on themselves as parents and on the role they played in her developmental knot, to quote Winnicott. In a session some months later, I commented on Emma's glancing towards my bookshelf. Silence. It gradually emerged that Emma was curious about, but unfamiliar with, the boxes containing Cluedo and Monopoly board games. She asked me what these were about. She displayed no interest in Cluedo, but when I said that Monopoly was about money, she grinned and looked cautiously interested. And so we began the game. Emma initially was very excited about the banknotes, asking, "Are they real money?" Each session, she immediately asked for the Monopoly. She felt humiliated when I sometimes won and looked dejected. She grew increasingly curious about the properties. Where are these places? She said she'd never heard of them, although maybe she'd been to Regent Street, to a huge toy store there. Then after several sessions, she joked. She asked jokingly, "Wonder how much your road costs?" I responded, "And my house?" She laughed and said that her parents' house was much bigger than mine. "Where do your children live? And you only have 1 bathroom. I have my own bedroom en suite." I wondered to myself how much she valued me, and perhaps imagined how much money I cost, if anything. She seemed to be following her parents into an identification with having possessions, a superiority accompanied by boastful competitiveness and some entitlement. I heard that at home Emma had quickly taken to Monopoly, which her parents had bought for her. In the consulting room, she asked me to close my eyes as she needed to do something. Sensing something amiss, I wondered aloud what might be going on. She laughed and replied, "Nothing." I then realized when I needed to pay for a fine in the board game that I seemed to have less money than before. I said, "Funny, I've got less than I thought I had." She smiled. "Maybe there were ghosts who took money when you weren't looking." I answered, "Cross ghosts who want more." She smiled. I was pleased to see her mischievousness, which was a relief from her frozen repetitive play of their initial encounters. One day her mother noticed her fingering something in her jeans pocket when I escorted her back to the waiting room at the end of her session. It was the silver cat counter she used to move around on the board. During one session, Emma couldn't conceal her delight on realizing that I had only £50 left. She held up her money, saying she had so much. She then let the notes fall onto the board, saying, "Look, it's raining money." She added, "Funny, there are no coins." I heard from her parents that she was receiving her first regular pocket money and had been asking how much things cost, thereby engaging with the reality of money. Emma was reluctant to spend, preferring to save. She told me she hid her money in her secret place. Family arguments had ensued over her stubborn hoarding. She told me that when she grows up, she wants to be a banker, own land, railway stations, houses and hotels, all like the Monopoly game. She would charge people loads of money. I talked about her enjoyment of collecting and holding tightly onto her money, adding that perhaps money was something she imagined she could keep, unlike people who came and went, and sometimes even disappeared from one another, like me and her. For a moment, she looked sad. Through the game, Emma monopolized my attention. Her inner poverty was palpable. She seemed to be indulged and deprived at the same time. This spaced intervention of twice weekly visits every few weeks, constituting 12 sessions per year, seemed acceptable to the family, and Emma was described as showing more curiosity and engagement in school. Her reports improved, and she began to sustain friendships. The way the parents paid me was noteworthy. Excuse the pun. Rather than send me a check or pay into my account, Mom or Dad would wait for a moment when Emma was looking elsewhere or was out of the room, and then very quickly leave an envelope under the vase on the waiting room table, or thank me, shaking my hand. I realized that I was being passed cash via the handshake. My association was to a tip, similarly slipped to a waiter in exchange for a well-positioned table. There are different challenges when working in the public sector, when services are delivered through the National Health Service, so not paid directly, or in a low-fee clinic, where the fees are administered by a third party. As there's no direct exchange, this means that thinking around payment can be avoided by the clinician and the family. 6-year-old Winston's low-income Caribbean family lived in modest circumstances, but regularly sent money home to their more needy relatives. Father was the main breadwinner. Mother's debilitating illness meant that she had to work part-time. The clinic where I met Winston was in a rather dilapidated, rambling house. My consulting room looked out onto the car park. Winston presented with aggressive outbursts at home. In identification with his mother, he could turn on a sixpence, switching rapidly between mental states. Unlike Emma, who initially was cut off from feelings, Winston immediately showed his passionate nature, and his powerful transference to me was evident from the outset. He attended 3 times weekly. Winston was intensely aware of the size of the clinic building and the number of rooms. He stretched out his arms to measure the dimensions of the consulting room and to show me how his small bedroom and much of the family's flat apartment fitted into the large space. Then he looked outside the window and, after a long silence, pointed to the parked cars which he imagined to belong to me and my family. When we played numerous car races, he said that he wanted to take his toy car home. It was a Friday afternoon. He stamped his feet and raged at me when I said that he wanted to take some of me with him to keep him company over the 3 days when we didn't see each other. He pushed me out of the room, shutting the door in my face. In fact, he locked it. Eventually, he emerged from the room, car in jeans pocket. His mother said he needed to give the car back to me. Winston looked at me tearfully, declared me to be a bad person, and announced that he was not coming to see me anymore. But he did. And his fantasies of owning the whole building, the entire street, indeed the whole of England, emerged. I interpreted his wish to be a rich king who could use his power to get who and what he wanted, including making his mom better. His wish to steal from me revealed his hunger and greediness. He had toys at home, but wanted more. He wanted me, a person, not a thing. As Winnicott, in a wonderful paper in 1950, wrote, "When a child steals, what is sought by the total child, that is the unconscious included, is not the object stolen. What is sought is the person, the mother, from whom the child has the right to steal because she is the mother." End of quote. So what Winnicott is talking about is the infant created the mother out of an innate capacity to love, and therefore has a rightful claim on his imaginary creation. To go back to Winston. Soon it emerged that the king, Winston, had a large car, an imaginary one, which he instructed me to walk around and admire. My car costs lots of money and it goes very fast. We went on car journeys together, stopping to buy me a sparkling diamond necklace. Money seemed to be linked to phallic, narcissistic, and Oedipal desires and a deep wish to be special in my eyes. Of course, there was also the dynamics around class and race, in that both Winston and his parents saw me as a privileged white analyst. They did not pay a fee, as treatment is free at the point of delivery in the NHS. At the end of the analysis, Winston's parents were immensely appreciative. They gave me a gift of a wristwatch. I understood this to mean, thanks for your time. I felt awkward in accepting this gift from this family who had limited means, but I chose to accept it as I thought it important not to hurt or shame them. Winston had a burdened but loving family, inner wealth, whereas Emma was more emotionally impoverished and had a rather absent family. She had less inner wealth. They both refound a playful good object in their work with me, indicating they had internalized some good enough early experiences which they could draw on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very interesting, and two very interesting cases for discussing afterwards. So now we are going to hear Salman's presentation. Salman Akhtar is Professor of Psychiatry at Jefferson Medical College and Training and Supervising Analyst at the Psychoanalytic Center of Philadelphia. He has served on the editorial boards of all three major journals of psychoanalysis. Author or editor of more than 100 books, he has received many prestigious recognitions, including the 2012 Sigourney Award for Distinguished Contributions to Psychoanalysis. So please, Salman.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. There is a lot to say, and time is limited. So I'm trying to organize my presentation in a slightly different way. I want to point out first three major statements of Freud about money, and say a few words each about where do they stand now. Then I'll talk about the 6 syndromes of pathology and return then to Freud's one of their statements. The three major statements Freud has made, one was in 1898 in a letter to Fliess. He says, happiness is the deferred fulfillment of a prehistoric wish. That is why wealth brings so little happiness, because money is not an infantile wish. One. Second statement was in 1908, where he says the original erotic interest in defecation is destined to be extinguished in later years. In those later years, the interest in money appears, which has been absent in childhood. This makes it easier for the earlier impulsion, which is in the process of losing its aim, to be carried over to the newly emerging aim, thus establishing the money feces equation. 2. The third one was in his technique papers. A given hour is assigned to each patient, and that hour is his, and he is responsible for it, even if he does not make use of it, charging for missed sessions. These are the three major statements of Freud about money. The first one, perhaps, I think, if it is restricted to early infancy, may be true. But if it is generalized to later childhood, may no longer be true. I think the world from 1898 Vienna to 1921 United States has changed in a remarkable fashion as far as consumerism, capitalism, and buying, purchasing, and daily involvement of life of money is involved, it begins much earlier. As Jennifer's paper suggested, that under certain circumstances, children are much more acutely and much earlier aware of money, just like of death. So I think the first statement has become a bit relative and has to be properly dated into early infancy. And secondly, it has to be corrected for the contemporary culture. The second statement about the feces money equation, nowhere the decline and downfall and the avoidance both of drive theories more evident in the money feces equation. The question then is not only whether the absence of the discussion of this equation in clinical situation is, especially in adults, is because of the ordinary shifting away from drive theory to ego and object relations and self-psychologies. Is it because of that? Or is it because of a major cultural repression in the West, especially in the United States, about feces and defecation? So that a patient may come for analysis for 8 years, 5 times a week, and never say that they have had a bowel movement. And the analyst is fine with that, and the patient is fine with that. And nobody asks or says anything about that. The question is really the patient not saying anything about it? Or is the analyst colluding in not listening about it? So that has also become a kind of interesting question. As the IPA is in the process of establishing a fourth region, data will emerge from other countries and other cultures, China, Japan, Korea, India. And we may find that the feces money equation may have more relevance and more need to be talked about and more need to be opened up than its other symbolic significances. Third, the comment about the given hour being assigned and a renting an apartment analogy used by Freud. I will return to the third matter at the end. About the involvement of money in psychopathology, I saw over the last 40, 50 years of clinical work, many different kinds of involvement of money in psychopathology. One is chronic miserliness. Now, miserliness is a kind of a Janus-faced situation. Outside or in the conscious and the pre-conscious, the miser feels frightened. Suppose I'm a miser and I say, Leo, let's go have a cup of coffee. And I have $10 in my pocket and coffee costs $2 and we are walking. And I now know that I have to pay for myself and my money will go from 10 to 8. Then suddenly a thought occurs to me. Is Leopold Nozek thinking I'm going to buy his coffee also? Oh my God, that'll mean I'll have only 6 left. That scares me. Because for me, money has become a prop to sustain the good internal object, which is weak. So money provides security, but if one doesn't have enough inner security, or what Jennifer called inner poverty, if one has inner poverty, then money's security providing functions become greater, and if it is removed, it causes automatic anxiety. So that is the conscious and pre-conscious element of miserliness. The unconscious element, which the miser is not in contact with and cannot be brought in contact with too quickly, and that is sadism. If my parents did not give me free things, and if I did not have access to my mother's body and love and attention, then why should I buy you coffee? Who are you? Why should you get things free from me when I did not get free things from them? So miserliness, I think whenever we are dealing, we have to first approach from the fear, anxiety, insecurity side, and much later from the sadistic side, because sadistic side is also present in miserliness. That's syndrome number 1. Syndrome number 2 is characterological overspending. It's a kind of a manic defense and manic trait of some people who love to spend far more money than they earn, far more money than they have, and far more money than they can afford. I knew a particular person who would tip toll booth operators. So he's driving on a highway, gives $5. The guy says $2. They said, keep the three. And he felt so good about it, and so powerful and so significant. And I think this had begun even early in psychoanalysis. Fenish's paper about amassing wealth had more to do, although he always, as a loyal lieutenant, paid service to the anal dimension, but had more to do with narcissism and power. And I think chronic overspending has to do with wanting to live a lofty life, a life that is not constrained by so-called reality. And one can live a trouble-free, restraint-free, unhobbled life, which is the manic defense that, where Winnicott talks about lightness as against heaviness and so. Second, the third is relentless generosity. I don't know whether you know anybody or not. I happen to know at least one, maybe two people who always give money to everybody. And it drives you crazy, actually. So now the question is that what is the difference between this kind of generosity, a relentless, insistent, ferocious generosity, as against a healthy, mature generosity? I think the differences are that in mature generosity, the person gives a reasonable amount. A person gives to the needy. A person gives without becoming masochistic and enjoying then that masochism and such. And the recipient feels grateful. In relentless, insistent, and ferocious generosity, the person gives more than they can afford, more than the situation demands, to people who do not need, and the person who is the recipient does not feel grateful. The recipient feels burdened and humiliated and hurt. That is another syndrome, which comes from not an identification with generous parents, but with identification with wished for and imagined and hallucinated generous parents, which is different. Just like there's a difference between eating a hamburger and eating a very beautiful painting of a hamburger. I think there's a difference. Same way, there's a difference between identifying with really present generous parents versus imagined and longed for generous parents. And that is what causes the relentless generosity, while the hungry self is projected into the recipient. Fourth, monetary masochism. There are people who stay in jobs and services for years, 30, 40, 50 years, never look for a raise, never ask for a raise, just keep making the same amount of money. Never, they invest money badly, they lose money, they become depressed when they get money, and so on. So the masochism finds a particular angle in abject and chronic, sometimes though subtle, self-deprivation in financial matters. 5, pathological gambling. Now, the gambler on surface is looking for big money. Actually, if you look closely, gambler is looking for 3 kinds of money. 1, big money. 2, quick money. And 3, free money. Big money, quick money, free money. And all of them, big money has to do with infantile omnipotence, because it makes you feel as if you have big money, you can do anything. The fact is, you can have 20, 30, 40 million, $100 million. You cannot marry your sister or brother. You cannot marry your son or daughter or mother or father. And if you do, nobody will ever talk to you. And rest of your family will not talk to you, and you will become a pariah. Intrafamilial and social pariah, and you will suffer very, very badly. Not only from external circumstances, but from internal guilt. And no matter how much money you have, you cannot become immortal. Walt Disney has his body frozen. It's not coming back to life. I don't think so. So as a result, you see the 2 human problems, that some things are impossible and some things are prohibited. Neither of them are taken care of by money. But the gambler thinks if he has big money, he can take care of both things. Not true. He wants big money. He wants quick money. He cannot wait. And waiting has to do with Oedipus complex. Waiting has to do first with, of course, the learning of the oral appeal cycle. Mother feeds, you wait, you get fed, need arises, mother feeds again. But mostly it has to do with Oedipus, that one is born in a generation that is lower, and one has to take time to arrive to that generation. Incapacity to wait, and the hurry, and the hurry is of two kinds: to get away from things, to get one is pre-Oedipal, one is Oedipal. Both are present in the game. Quick, finally, free. Free has to do with getting army, love. So the gambler is looking for quick, free, and big money, all of them infantile fantasies and childhood fantasies. The gambler knows that what he is doing is defying reality, and therefore he has unconscious guilt, and therefore he always loses money. So on the conscious and pre-conscious level, the gambler is looking for big, quick, and free money. At the unconscious level, he's looking for the punishment, and he's a monetary masochist. Finally, there's the syndrome of chronic bargain hunting. There are people who will buy 5 toothpastes or 25 toothbrushes because the price was good. Sometimes they drive far distances, 30, 40 miles out of town, because in that town, something is cheap. The gas is cheaper. They don't realize that they're wasting petrol while on the way. But to get their car filled, they'll go that far, not calculating that they have lost pretty much the same amount of money. I know people who go to buy beer, wine, whiskey, 30, 40 miles because that is cheaper there. Not realizing the waste of time, not realizing the waste of effort, being on a highway, and so on and so forth. This chronic bargain hunting has to do with a particular rat-like tendency to extract something extra. It is evident in the work of Leonard Shengold, also earlier on in Winnicott's paper on antisocial tendency. These are 6 syndromes: chronic miserliness, characterological overspending, relentless generosity, monetary masochism, pathological gambling, and chronic bargain hunting. Now back to last comment of Freud, and then I'll end. And that is, a given hour is assigned to each patient. And the hour is his, and he is responsible for it, even if he does not make use to it. This gave rise to the policy of charging for missed sessions. A patient missed a session, the analyst charge. Now, and the rationalization early on was that this is the absence is related to resistance. Gradually, this became a kind of magical icon of being a real good analyst, that you charge for all missed sessions. Then some people began to make exception. If the patient is ill, if the patient is hospitalized, if there's a natural calamity, if a child in the family is ill, if the mother is dying, if the father is dying, if there's a car accident, if the plane got delayed, bit by bit, these kinds of things began to appear. Then some people developed some kind of compromises. You tell me 24 hours in advance, 22 weeks in advance, 1 week in advance, and such. I have known some horrifying examples. I've known examples of patients being charged on their religious holidays. I have known of the example of a person telling an analyst in October that I have an academic situation where I have to do some academic work 1,000 miles from here, and I have to go away for 3 weeks, and the analyst charging for all 15 sessions. Those 3 weeks that the analyst had been informed for some 6 months before, and such for an academic reason. Bit by bit, and I grew up with, when I was a candidate and early analyst, I grew up with the tradition of charging for all missed sessions, with the rationalization that way one doesn't take a superego position, one doesn't decide this is good absence, this is bad absence, blah, blah. I have moved not only to this side, I moved now to completely 100% opposite side. I've come to believe that people who are in analysis, who have what Freud called a fairly reliable character, and who have a decent therapeutic alliance, and who are working in a reasonable, reliable, and productive manner in psychoanalysis, if they miss a session, the analyst must not charge for any missed sessions. Only I've come this way and made one exception that way, meaning I've gone extreme left and now make one exception. Only when the analyst is absolutely sure and can demonstrate to himself and to the patient through clinical data in the here and now that this is an acting out. And this is a sadistic and a hostile attack on the analyst or the analytic process. Then, now, where did this idea come from to Freud, and why? And why have we not questioned it? It came to him because, number one, his father left him no money. He had no inheritance. Two, he had no academic job and no hospital salary. Three, his patients, many of them were doing nothing, sitting the whole day waiting for the analytic session, having coffee and reading newspapers. If they forgot to come, that was a different ballgame. Four, bigger thing, all his money was coming from private practice. And fifth, the biggest thing is he had 6 children, 2 dogs, 6 children, 2 dogs, 4 adults. He, his wife's sister, and a maid. He had 12 mouths to feed. 12 mouths to feed. 6 children, 2 dogs, 4 grown-up adults eating food every day from his money. The situation has changed. Doctors have inheritances, doctors have retirement funds, our patients are very busy. None of us have 12 people to feed. We have to think this was an idiosyncratic necessity of a poor, struggling physician who had large number of dependents. That is not the case now. Our patients are very busy, they have hectic lives, and in the setting of hectic lives, if a patient is utterly reliable and then has to miss a session, I don't think we should stop. I think this charging for missed session policy, in my opinion, and I can cite one other analyst in my who has written explicitly about this, Herbert Schlesinger, that I think this charging this missed session business is an old relic that we have sort of decorated our living rooms with because it looks good, meaning it serves us well. It serves the analyst's personal desires, functions, and necessities. And it overlooks. Freud said that the analyst should not be too sacrificing. I disagree with that. I'm a doctor, I'm a physician. I believe sacrifice is a part of being a physician, and an analyst, as me, who's a physician, I think that's part of sacrifice. There are silent sacrifices we commit as mothers and fathers, and there are silent sacrifices we should be willing to commit as psychoanalysts. Thank you.
Thank you, Salman, very much for your presentation. And now we will go on with Leo Nosek. He's graduate in medicine from the University of Sao Paulo, Faculty of Medicine, supervisory psychoanalyst with the Sao Paulo Brazilian Society of Psychoanalysis, curator and co-curator of art exhibitions, author of the book A Disposição para o Assombro, Disposition to All, published by Perspectiva. He received the Sigourney Award in 2014. Please, Leo.
I'm very pleased to be here with Jennifer and Salman, old friends, and Sylvia, which we know each other for a long time. I will talk about psychoanalysis and money in a general form, and I will share some ideas just to begin a discussion. Here, psychoanalysis and money, we have two terms of infinite complexity. In the short time we have, I will present some generalizations that correspond summarily to my opinions on the theme. A variable I see repeatedly in analysis is the state of rootlessness. This is one of the possible pursuit of origin that which give us a sense of our own meaning. Accordingly, as we may seek our citizenships in ideology, in culture, or in politics, analysis configures the pursuit of the origin of each one owns personal history. It's not a pursuit in the past, but rather a search into our foundations, a kind of forgotten platform over which our building is erected, our history, and the way in which we build it. Despite considering clinical practice today to be related to an installation or a performance, I believe the basic framework of an analytical configuration must necessarily contain the concepts of unconscious, transference, repression, and infantile sexuality. This constitutes the framework, the beginning of the framework of our practice. An analysis occurs in a situation that mimics an alcove, being a place of sexual happenings, and also a temple, because it is the sacred birthplace of the word, of the verb, as the scriptures state. Thus, our discipline deals with words and will always fluctuate between a talking cure and a listening cure. But words have textures, musicalities, colors, weight, and many other attributes. They also contain origins and yearnings, and sometimes actuality. A discourse has synchronies, diachronies, and anachronisms. They therefore resonate with poetry. For the purpose of this discussion, I would say that words develop containing shades and are present accompanied by countless ghosts. As a metaphor, I would say in an analysis, words are accompanied by ghosts that come without the shit we associate with them and that enable their vision. It is up to the analysis to give them shape. As in Bio's idea of binocular vision, I think we hear ghosts that accompany the words and do not run the risk of projecting our own phantoms. The discourse here is accompanied by the vision and perception of the ghosts that are present in the contour of two subjectivities. To complicate things further, uh, we know the classical originals remain, but translations are dated, imbued with the spirit of the moment they are realized, and inevitably became anachronic. Such will be the destiny of words offered in analysis. Myths help us in our task, and in this discussion, which the second term is money, I will use a Nordic mythology as translated by Richard Wagner. The Ring of Nibelung cycle, over 16 hours of stories and music, begins with the opera The Rheingold. Before the curtains open, we hear a single chord in E flat for incredible 136 seconds, 136 beats, which, with the orchestration, mimics the movement of the waters of the river Rhine. When the story begins, we see three beautiful river nymphs seducing the dwarf Alberic. He desperately wants and pursues them. They always tease him and escape. Next comes the moment I want to establish. Angry, Alberic curses love, which makes an ancient prophecy come true. The Rhine ghost became visible, and to the despair of the guardians, the dwarfs steal it. Wotan, the most powerful of the gods, had made Valhalla a palace for his wife. Unable to pay the giants, Fafnir and Fasolt, he steals the gold from Alberic, who lives deep underground. However, previously with the same gold, the dwarf had made a ring that would give whoever possessed it the power to destroy the world, and which now belongs to the giants. On the three following nights, there is a crescendo as Wotan struggles for power in a fight involving heroes, gods, giants, and inhabitants of the underworld until Valhalla falls. Mythology will permit many interpretations. By here, I will refer to the renunciation of love and the opening to the possession of wealth and power. In the entire cycle, there is no single gesture of solidarity or what we may call good character. We can see classes in dispute. In various productions, including in Bayreuth, modern costumes are used. Perhaps I remembered Wagner because I want to end my intervention addressing the Goering Institute of Psychoanalytic Institute of the German Reich. In a famous test written in 1848, this test described the movement of wealth as follows. It says that wealth has no ethics, morals, or homeland. It does not respect borders, customs, or traditions. It destroys established professions and forms of social relations, and in these movements creates new forms of social ruthlessness. Wealth provokes a permanent revolution, and in this movement builds and destroys beautiful things. I see echoes of this citation in the recent work of Zygmunt Bauman in his definition of liquid society, as well in the title of Mila Kunder's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I will quote this passage. This constant shock against the whole social system, this perpetual mutation and insecurity distinguish our age from all previous one. This is 1984. All previous one. All traditional crystallized relations dissolve with their train of beliefs and preconceived and venerated ideas. The relations that substitute them are antiquated before they became consolidated. Everything considered solid and stable unravels. Everything that was sacred is profaned, and men are finally forced to face up to the condition of their existence and their reciprocal relations with no illusions. This test, I remember, is from 1848. It's quite actual. What we see today is that the whole planet itself is at risk. I think the test ends with an optimistic, idealized vision, though the correction of description face up to condition does not occur. What we will have will be attempts at new construction of thought, new ideas, new beliefs and accounts. New sacred ideas substitute those no longer used. Another alternative would be not to have stories to tell, as Walter Benjamin described the traumatic. These soldiers who returned from the battlefield without stories to tell. In these decades in which I practiced psychoanalysis and participated in our institution, I have seen major transformations that occur together with the transformations of the world. As psychoanalysis addresses ruthless, the traumatic of the absence of narrative, psychoanalysis will necessarily have a strong role in the construction of the thought of our era. Remember once more that when the new has not yet emerged and the old has disappeared, conditions are ripe for the birth of monsters. I will now give a real example of what I formulated previously, the Third Reich Goering Institute of Psychoanalysis. For whoever wants to know more about this, I recommend Jeffrey Scott's excellent book, which broadened my vision of this period. Just as 1848, remarkable 1918 changed the world. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which extended over Western Europe with 60 million inhabitants, was reduced to Austria with around 6 million. Germany, a slower developer than other European countries, industrialized later and did not participate in the colonial division of the world. Upon the defeat of the First World War, it inherited enormous economic destruction, inflation, and impoverishment. Simultaneously, the arts and the culture flourished exuberantly. In parallel, the serpent's egg was being hatched. With the advent of Nazism, psychoanalysis survived, eliminating the Jews, women, conflict, and infantile sexuality. The name Freud was unmentionable, and theories close to Adler and Jung prospered. Directed by Goering, a cousin of the Reich Marshal Goering, psychoanalysis became a vehicle for nurturing the Aryan soul. Citizens should be productive, and women will have the maternal function of peopling the slave territories of Greater Germany. What surprised me, and shouldn't, is the universal adaptation to this monstrous set of ideas. What did they have to renounce as outrage to maintain their professional life alive? The psychotherapists of the Reich exercised and fought for the specificity and development of their discipline in confrontation with psychiatry, which did not accept them. They grew enormously during this period. The result of the late Romanticism, the ideas which shaped the official ideology, it was their role to care for the suffering of the Aryan soul. The clinic for people in financial difficulty did not reach this proportion in any other historical circumstance. The ambulatories were full of these possessed people. Note that different from the psychiatrists, the psychotherapists did not participate in the gassing of creatures falling short in productivity or suffering from so-called hereditary issues. After the war, all the participants in the Goering Institute continued to the practice, including Werner Kemper, who was the director of the institute and who moved to Brazil, where he founded a society, initiating events which I will not go on into now, but it's quite well known the problems we have during the dictatorship with some analysts in Rio de Janeiro. Undoubtedly, today we are seeing a major social and economic transformation. Monsters haunt us, and we do not know the future. Our practice in its singularity is also undergoing change. We will gradually have to face up. Psychoanalysis treats individuals, but its theory will address human universals. The construction of the spirit and thought is our area of expertise, and where we should collaborate. We must question, as Albrecht did, what are we giving up? In the Goering Institutes, our ideology will inevitably influence our belief, but discussion imposes itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, very much. Now is the time for answering the questions, but before that, I don't know if you would like to discuss between you three some of the concepts you just mentioned. I think that each presentation was related with different things, so perhaps it's not easy just to discuss between you. So if you want to, I can begin telling you some of the questions. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfectly.
I think it's very interesting to look at the interface between the internal world and the kind of shifts in the world that we live in. And I was interested in what, Salman, you were saying about the consumerism, the value of money, and then Leopold picking up from, I think I couldn't hear all the words so well, but picking up from you about the sort of fantasies that people have about wealth. I think there's a sort of common theme in all our presentations about that somehow money is an illusory object. It's going to bring something that is actually unobtainable. And that seems to be running through our presentations. But also I was thinking about, with all the emphasis on climate change, and at the moment during the pandemic, certainly in England, you can't buy things like you used to buy before. You just, you want a new fridge, or your machine is broken or whatever. And you're told, sorry, but we've got a problem with the supply chain. So it's curious, this kind of frustration on a collective level, economic level, and this sort of it seems to replicate or be happening at the same time, let's put it that way, simultaneously, a feeling of inner poverty, I would call, that I can only speak for my experience with English patients, and to some extent with South African community projects. There's this feeling of that with the pandemic, that we're facing so much illness, so much loss, and what this reverberates in the world, the internal world. Also, what I'm noticing in England is how family structures are changing. I'd be interested how you see in America, in South America. For example, basic values have been revisited, that families have said, well, what are our basic values? And some families have decided, I'm talking about middle class families, who obviously have more choices. Some families have decided that the one parent will go to work and the other parent will give up either part-time or maybe completely to stay at home to look after the children, especially in the homeschooling time of the pandemic. Here in Britain, we had a lockdown, the schools were closed, and that's what happened for parents who could afford to do that. But I have some patients who've told me that their attitude towards money has changed, that they've really had to think about what does money mean, and also mourn the fact that the fantasy, the illusion that money could buy. It can't buy everything, that's for sure. So I just throw that out.
I see a couple of things.
Please.
In response to what Jennifer just said, I think what we see here in the United States, that the COVID epidemic and pandemic has affected money, but in very peculiar ways. For some, spending has become difficult, and therefore they are actually having more money and saving more money. And that is puzzling them and making them happy also, but also causing them a little bit of anxiety. Many have lost jobs, and that has caused economic hardships. So there is a disturbance of money in the current system. There's no doubt, but it cuts both ways. I wanted to add two more topics for just to identify them and flag them so that we may or may not address, but we certainly need to think. One is a clinical one is a social one. Clinical matter is that there are also certain clinical conditions in which an analyst has to refuse to take the money from the patient, actively decline the patient's paying money. There are clinical conditions like that. So if the patient is, let's take an example and make one up, but made one up is based upon experience. And that is if somebody has been sexually abused and now they come in analysis and then they have a lot of money and they begin offering you as a gift, as a service, as admiration of your work or some such thing. And you become aware that they are actually, the money is now their body that they're inviting you to touch or not touch, and so on and so forth. So that there could be many situations, many people from the first session try to set up a perverse therapeutic alliance by peculiar offers of money. An analyst friend of mine got an offer that of an enormous amount of money, on the condition that he would not treat anybody else. He'll just treat one patient. And that is setting up a kind of peculiar and a perverse therapeutic alliance, so I think that many situations, and one can go in detail, where an analyst has to actively decline taking the money. That's one. From outside, going out of the clinical realm into a bigger realm, and that is the involvement of money in psychoanalytic profession. In the paper on beginning the treatment, Freud has a paragraph about can poor people afford psychoanalysis and what to do about that and such. And now, one time I jokingly said to Don Campbell, who was then the president of British Society, that we can have a study, say, we can see what is the average price of a training analyst's car and what is the status of psychoanalysis in that country. That if so much money is being charged, like for example in New York, people are charging usually $300 or $400 a session. So if the patient goes 3 times a week, it's $55,000 a year. If a patient goes 5 times a week, it's $87,000 a year. $87,000 a year. If the analysis lasts for about 10 years, it's $1 million. You see what I'm saying? That this has also created all kinds of difficulties. Especially in the United States, the money and the practice of psychoanalysis became very intricately close together. Analysts driving extremely expensive cars, living in extremely fancy houses, and so on and so forth, and feeling deserving of that kind of lifestyle led, I think, to psychiatry and psychoanalysis getting divorced because kids were coming out of medical school with so many loans. So they don't want to go in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic training because they have to pay money for their training analysts. So all kinds of involvements of money have also hurt our profession. And we need to look at it and think about it and do something.
See, perhaps I can make clearer my intentions. I want to say that big transformations in society take us to the point to revisit the traumatic. People come to our sessions without words or without very narrow narratives, very poor and very full of certainties. We have the problem, we can see the country is divided in left and it's difficult to have a patient, perhaps you know, who is strongly attached to the ideas of Bolsonaro. He has very short certainties and he has a sort of ideas it's difficult to stand with. I imagine in the United States the same happens with Trump ideas and so on. So when the changes of the society, the concentration of wealth, the chemical laboratories, they change the way we deal with depression. 3 or 4 of the major companies in the world are pharmacy companies. So people are all, a poet as Salman is, perhaps he can describe a new state so common. How do you feel? I am antidepressed. What kind of state is that? Are you happy? No, no, I am antidepressed. And all the organization, the family's organization change. So we revisit the necessity of building words. That's the task of the traumatic situations. Everything has changed. We don't have the words to face our day-to-day life. So, psychoanalysis as building thoughts has a very strong role in this, in several disciplines that are thinking the major changes that we are facing in society. In facing money, pocket money, which patient pay us, I prefer not giving them. I use other associations to put a sheet over the ghosts because they will repeat this in other situations. And when money enters, I feel I am suspicious because I'm strongly interested. I have the desire to receive. I don't have so many people as Freud has, but I have 5 children, 10 grandchildren, and so on. Money. So when people don't pay me, I try to deal with this objectively and wait another sheet to put over the ghost. It's a personal choice, and it works also. Psychoanalysis is very personal. I don't want to teach anyone how to do this, but just telling you how I deal with that.
I was thinking that the discussion goes in different levels, because one thing is the social situation, the political one, and so on. But I'm reading the questions, and it seems that the audience is more interested in the specific consultation issue related with money. So I would like to read 3 questions, and after that you could talk about what you think over this. One says, other than the question of not charging a fee for missed sessions and noting that female clinicians charge less than the male colleagues, are there other contemporary pressing questions or issues surrounding the clinician's fee? Another one is, in addition to the aforementioned differences in value and more or less symptomatic use of money according to the age of the patients, the region of origin might tell us something about possible differences between genders. And the last one for now, as analysts from 3 different IPA regions, what sense do you have about how analytic fees are handled in the other regions? Well, it's more or less the same. And it says, for example, Hannah Siegel once said that American analysts could have more analysans if they were willing to charge less per hour. And I read also that they asked about the sacrifice that Salman spoke about. So if you would like to answer some of these questions, I don't know who wants to begin.
I'll say a few things. I think this Hannah Siegel observation is absolutely correct. I think it's absolutely correct. I think the fees that are charged by American analysts are very high and has harmed the profession of psychoanalysis. And I think if we charge less money, we can help more people, have more analysans and such. A peculiar thing about American society also is that the medical students who graduate from school become doctors, almost invariably have a huge amount of loan, 200, 300, 400,000 dollars on their head. And therefore, they are afraid to go in a training which would cost. And they avoid psychiatry. They want to go to specialties which will make them a lot of money. So that is American society. But as far as this observation is concerned, I'm 100% sure of its correctness. I think there are many, many other clinical situations. For example, the schedule of payments. Freud would mostly charge once a month, but to some patients he charged once a week. To some patients he charged every time. So that he had a kind of variable schedule. And I think we need to free ourselves from this kind of given prison that we have to charge once a month. We can regulate this and see how it works. I'm not in favor of every session. Every session, I think that creates an additional complication, contamination, and a situation of somewhat implicit mistrust and highlights the realistic aspect of psychoanalysis more than the imaginative aspects. So I'm not in favor of once every session, but certainly one can try once in 3 months, 4 times a year or something. I have 2 patients that I charge 4 times a year. And it's a very interesting thing. It can create different internal fantasies, both in the analyst and the analyst's mind. But certainly these are things to play with and see how they work and whether they are better or not. Secondly, I want to ask Jennifer about this situation. When young kids come, I mean, I'm not a child analyst, but I'm talking even of 21-year-old, a college student, 19-year-old. They say, my father will pay it. My parents will pay it. And why don't you send them the bill? My experience has been that by and large, I have said, I'll give you the bill. You take the money from your father, you give me. That is, but what do you think about this? I mean, about billing the parents, especially, I mean, for 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old is a different thing, of course. I'm talking about 18, 19. What's your sense about involvement of parents in payment? And does it do any better? Am I doing something good, or I'm just thinking that I'm doing something good?
I think it's, first of all, I want to say that I think children sense the exchange that goes on between the analyst and the parent. When that envelope was put under the vase in the waiting room table, that child noticed it, and eventually it was talked about. Why does she do that? So the subject of secrets. So I think children pick things up a lot. Secondly, about the 19-year-old, in my practice, I vary my practice, but the adolescents are well aware of money being paid.
Yes.
And sometimes there've been some adolescents who brought the subject into the consulting room where we have talked about, do they know about the bill? Parents have complained sometimes when I've given the bill to the adolescent patient. What are you doing? What are you doing to my child? How dare you involve him in that? That's between us and you. So it opens up all sorts of dynamics, but it goes back to the shit that you referred to and Leopold referred to, that somehow money is regarded as a topic that you don't talk about. Some people, it's improper behavior to bring it to it happen. And now we have another problem of how money is paid through bank transfers. So it's all this virtual exchange that goes on. So it can be even more avoided. Or if you work in the NHS, the National Health Service, I have supervisees when they start to go into private practice, they've never dealt with money before. because it was all done by somebody else behind the scenes. You know, if somebody else was dealing with it. The idea that you pay taxes and then everybody has the right to treatment in the NHS in this country, or a low fee clinic. It's dealt with by a third party. So there are all these ways of not getting involved with it. But I'm aware that there are questions, and perhaps Sylvia is wanting us to look at some of these very interesting questions that are appearing here.
I saw one about inflation. Sorry, go on.
You see, I think that dealing with money is also a very individual situation. People, colleagues of mine, they went to London to make their training. How much cost this? Other to Paris. They went to Paris, they moved their family, and they wanted to make a training. How much cost this? It's so relative. We must see case to case. When I worked in a public hospital, we gave analysis freely, no cost. But people said, I don't have a person to leave my children. They cannot stay at home, so I don't have resources. I used to listen when people say I don't have money. I try to listen. I don't have resources. Money is one of the resources. I don't have to. You have the security. Many of the young analysts in Brazil, they are working with security, low charges, and many people go to this analysis. So, unfortunately, we think in institutions how to deal what Freud did. It's very interesting reading about the economic life of Freud. When he left Vienna, he had accounts in several banks over Europe, and there was a Nazi who helped him to live and to have the money to buy his house in London, to take his collection. This was very rare. He sympathized with Freud, and Freud the hidden accounts over. He survived with American patients. With American patients, probably he had to deal different if he had an American patient who pay in dollar in that situation of inflation, or an inhabitant from Vienna. It's different. So it's very hard to generalize. If women charge less than men, this is a reality much larger than a set of psychoanalysis. In 62, till 62 in Brazil, women were not allowed to sign documents or checks. Their husband or father has to sign. Completely equal rights women have since the Constitution of 88. You don't see women in our governments. You don't see in so many places. So we now are dealing with general problems. So general problems has to fight with general concepts. Psychoanalysts cannot fix the world in his own office. So we have to deal.
Well, I'm not so sure, because I have some contacts with psychoanalysis in South Africa, and these kind of issues do get addressed in order for psychoanalysis to actually take hold in South Africa. These kind of things have been said. What, you know, psychoanalysis is this bourgeois European discipline. How does it fit in with Africa? And I'm very proud that some of my colleagues have taken these challenges and these questions that needed to be said very seriously. And, you know, I don't think it only belongs in South Africa. I think it's also an internal question. I don't think it's only a collective question. Why women, I didn't know that women had to sign, you know, get what you described about the checks. I had no idea. I have to say, I feel quite shocked.
Before 62.
Yeah, I had no idea. I had no idea. It's really news to me. But why is it that female analysts, some female analysts, not all female analysts, charge less? Why is it? Now, some people say, oh, well, I had a husband who gave me money, or you know, I work with children, so it's less value working with children. What absolute nonsense. Child analysis is vital, absolutely vital. The children are the future. So I think it's not only in the collective, Leopold. Don't you think it's also something that psychoanalysis can help people look at this, at what they are doing, and the message of devaluing what we give? Because we give amazing things to our patients. And look at other professions. I'm going to bring in envy here, because look at lawyers. Certainly in this country, lawyers cost a fortune. You speak to them for 5 minutes on the phone and you're thinking, oh my gosh, that's costing a fortune. You go and see a private doctor, it costs you a fortune. And I sometimes think a real envy. These people value what they do. They might overvalue it too. But what are we actually doing in psychoanalysis? That we do have to charge a fee that the patient values. And we also have to maybe make some space for patients who really can't afford analysis. It used to be, I think, that one case in your practice as a psychoanalyst here in Britain was sort of suggested that you might take on one low fee analysis. That used, and I don't see anybody that I know, including myself, I have to say, doing that.
I see, I agree. We should, with each woman, with many women patients, I am dealing with this preconception and violence and everything. So that's I'm dealing with a personal patient. My point is that we should contribute thinking broader, seeing the society how it works, seeing we as part. We don't have only the problem with the patient. We see a general situation. So psychoanalysts should contribute with their thinking, making their presence in social forums, in political forums. Many things we are saying here have an ideological underground.
One thing.
So we should look at our ideology. With which ideology do I work?
The thing I want to add to
We
what
have 1 minute more, Salman.
I'll be very quick. Just the way the poverty that Jennifer said could be internal and external, so can womanliness. I mean, if you take Ferenczi and Klein, Mrs. Klein and Ferenczi, I think Ferenczi was more of a woman than Mrs. Klein. You see, it has to do with it. Our profession is basically a maternal profession. Fundamentally, psychoanalysis is a maternal profession when it comes to holding, containing, and paternal profession when it comes to deciphering and interpreting. So we have to have both attributes. It depends upon how much maternal identification is internally present comfortably. That I think, because in general, we don't know. Of course, I just showed the biggest historical exception, Mrs. Klein versus Ferenczi, but maybe women are closer to the maternal identification, and therefore to them charging less fee does not appear such a sacrifice, you see, as it can appear to men who have anxieties about maternal fee giving and such.
I think that is
charging less. It's just charging less. I have patients that don't pay me for 2 years because he has a lawsuit and so. I won't interrupt Anna. So it's a personal question. It's not. We are trying to make a general.
Yeah, no rules.
Sorry, I have to interrupt because we don't have more time. We thank you so much for the presentations and everything you talked about related with money and the social issues and the new families. I will tell the people and you that our next webinar will be about rainbow families. And we will have as panelists Jack Dresser, Patricia Gerovici, Dirk Blitztra. That's difficult for me to pronounce. And the moderator will be Mariano, and also a podcast related with this, Couples and Families, a Psychoanalytic Perspective on Money Issues by Paulina Zuckerman. So we will go on thinking about all these things and try to put them all together. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for the audience also.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Jennifer, for organizing all this.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi.